Yes, yay God. Jonah the coward. So we've all heard of Jonah and maybe have different ideas about who he is, why he's significant. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're thinking, coward? Seems a little harsh, Matt. Seems like a strong label. And you might be right. I mean, if I were Jonah, I might be terrified if I were being eaten by a giant fish. Might start to sweat a little, stammer a bit, make a few uncomfortable jokes in my nervous state. But that wouldn't make me a coward, would it? So let's talk about this label I've given Jonah. A coward has no courage. Courage is a kind of strength of mind, of heart, of will, that helps you overcome obstacles and stand firm in the face of dangers and threats of all kinds. Sometimes courage can take the form of great actions done for the sake of others, maybe the kind of courage we associate with heroes. Patience and perseverance are a kind of courage, I think. The ability to endure something difficult without being overcome by it, and the ability to persist at some good thing. Diligence, devotion, hope, trust, all of these take a kind of courage. And cowards, I think a coward is weighed down by fear, lacks confidence. I think a coward can't face a situation that could potentially cost him or her something, cannot be vulnerable, authentic. I think a coward doesn't believe in him or herself, lacks hope, can't speak up for the sake of love and justice and care for others, or can't keep silent for these same ends, if appropriate. I think a coward can't rise up for a noble cause, can't risk doing something good for others if knowing he or she won't be properly appreciated or praised. I think when opportunity calls, a coward freezes or runs away. Now, I don't think most of us are really simply cowards or not cowards. I think it's not an on and off switch, but maybe more like a dimmer. The journey away from cowardice to courage is just that. It's a journey. It's not instantaneous. But for the sake of dramatic clarity, let's try to speak in these extremes. So Jonah, do you see a coward? I think in the passage that Michelle just read, that Jonah comes off pretty well, actually. He goes to an exceedingly large city on a 3 days journey across. And he goes, he preaches a very likely unpopular message of criticism. Those things seem really brave to me. And what was he critiquing? The book of Jonah calls the city wicked. And what God tends to get upset about in the Old Testament, I'd say, is probably not too different from what frustrates God today. Greed, inequality, violence, hatred, exploitation, oppression, numb indifference, and so on. And I imagine a lot of people were probably suffering, either from their own vice and brokenness, or as a result of the vice and brokenness of others. So you would think that being tasked with the role to go into the city and announce judgment, and as a foreigner, might not end well. 40 days more, and Nineveh will be overthrown, was the message, which you might notice employs the use of the number 40. If you recall, it rained for 40 days while Noah was in the ark, and 40 nights, of course. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. Jesus fasted and was tempted for 40 days. 40 in Scripture typically suggests a kind of judgment, but also maybe a purging, a renewal, a transformation, and can signify that God keeps God's promises, that God is trustworthy, that God prefers not to destroy things, but to fix things. But I mean, couldn't you imagine Jonah thinking through possible outcomes? Okay, so I go into the city, and I tell people, change your ways, or God will bring calamity against you. The people will look at me, a foreigner, and laugh some more, and then probably stick a dagger in my face. So to be fair to Jonah, despite my unflattering label, this was a huge undertaking, some potential consequences for his well-being. This was danger. And looking at chapter 3, it seems like Jonah passes with flying colors. Jonah enters a foreign land. He enters the unknown. That's courageous. He makes himself vulnerable. That's courageous. He has no guarantees about the future outcomes of his mission. But he goes, nonetheless. That's courageous. He verbally, directly confronts people about their wrongdoing. That's courageous. Maybe this was a call to let go of some prior obligation. That's courageous. Maybe this was a call to embrace his own gifts, his own unique destiny. That's courageous. He seemingly finishes what he starts, sees this massive preaching tour all the way through. That's courageous. So Jonah seems courageous. Did you do the slides? I think you got my title wrong. Jonah does not seem like a coward, Michelle. Well, before I completely throw Michelle under the bus, let's take a step back to chapter 1 of Jonah, because it was a bit of a dramatic or traumatic journey to this point. God tasks Jonah to go to Nineveh and cry out against their wickedness. And chapter 1 Jonah, unlike chapter 3 Jonah, does not go, but sets out to flee to Tarshish. It's kind of a fun word to say, Tarshish. He sets out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He finds a ship, pays his fare, gets on board, all, again, to get away from God's presence. In other words, he hides. Jonah hides. And as the story goes, God seems to not be satisfied with this ending. God doesn't say, well, guess I'll find somebody else if Jonah's not up for it. In fact, I don't think God chose Jonah haphazardly, nor do I think God was surprised at the fact that Jonah hid. I think God chose Jonah intentionally. So God, naturally, sends a storm to cause chaos to the ship. All of the sailors on board are terrified, and so they start praying to their gods to calm the storm. They start throwing cargo overboard to lighten the ship. So they feel fear, certainly, but they're proactive. They're out in the elements. They're doing what they can through prayer and action to face this danger. But where's Jonah? The passage says that during all this, Jonah had gone down into the hold of the ship and laid down and was fast asleep. Danger comes, and Jonah hides. Why? I think maybe he just didn't have the capacity to act in this situation. And maybe he hid because he knew the storm was his fault and he was ashamed, unwilling to face others or face God or face himself. Well, eventually the captain of the ship finds him, essentially says, pray, help, get off your expletive, and do something, help us. Eventually, the sailor figures out that Jonah is the cause of this chaos. And that's when Jonah finally confesses. After they drag the information out of him by interrogation, he says that he worships Yahweh. And this name terrifies the sailors, who know right away that Jonah is running away from God, from call, from responsibility. Well, the storm keeps raging, and the sailors ask him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? And you'd think maybe now, finally, Jonah would rise to the occasion and simply turn back to God, turn back to his call. But nope. He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this storm has come upon you. See, I think Jonah knew at this point if he would just say, okay, I'll go to Nineveh, that the storm would calm and that these sailors would survive. But he'd rather be thrown overboard. And I don't think that this is heroic self-sacrifice. I don't think that quite fits the arc of Jonah's character or the narrative. I think he makes a cowardly choice here. I think that he would rather die than face whatever fears he may have had about responding to God's call. Maybe he thinks he'll fail. Maybe he thinks he'll be mocked. Maybe he thinks he'll be beaten up. But he has sunk so low, no pun intended, that he'd now rather just die. Well, you all probably know what happens next. The sailors, with great hesitation, throw Jonah overboard. But God's still not ready to give up. God sends a large fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah lives, we assume conscious and safe, for 3 days and 3 nights. Also a significant number in Scripture, the number 3, maybe suggesting a kind of dying and rising, a rebirth, a transformation. And finally, Jonah stops hiding. Something happens in Jonah, and he finally prays. He finally gets it. He praises God for answering him in his distress, for hearing him, for not giving up on him, for literally and figuratively rescuing Jonah from the waters closing in, from the weeds wrapped around his head, from the bars closed upon him, as the text says, from imprisonment, but self-imposed imprisonment, I think. God brought his life up from the pit. Jonah says, "As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord." As my life was ebbing away. I love that. Not as I was being mean or naughty or disobedient, but rather I was wasting away to nothing. I was slowly dying, existentially and spiritually, but probably physically too, given the way our anxieties affect our bodies. But then, with new resolve that perhaps could have only come through this kind of experience, he vows to face his fears, to respond to God's call. A call not just to do something, but to become something. How might God be calling you, like Jonah, to some act or acts of courage? Maybe you need to be more direct and clear with people in your communication. Maybe you need to converse with people that make you feel uncomfortable or agitated. Maybe you need to speak up and get over the fear that people will think your ideas aren't any good. Maybe you need to shut up if it means trusting others, releasing control, and letting people do things their own way. Maybe you need to be authentic about your identity, your passions, without fear of being judged. Maybe you need to take more risks with your career, your schoolwork, your projects, without feeling like you'll be exposed as an imposter or letting the possibility of failure stifle you. Maybe you need to help that person out, even if you think it's not your business, or you don't have time, or it will demand too much of you. Or maybe you need to set stronger boundaries, even if it will upset people. And maybe you might have to admit that you do not have all the answers, that you are finite, that certainty might be an illusion, that life requires living with some unknowns, with some mystery, and that this ambiguity is good and right. It's part of what's meant by the life of faith. Since all 9 of these examples I've just given are areas of growth for me, maybe more than one of them apply to you. It doesn't feel good to be cowardly, to be afraid. I think Jonah was probably not all that happy of a person. And more courage, or more of any virtue, won't help God love us anymore, but it might liberate us, open up doors, maybe even help us love and be loved a little better. But the thing is, my lack of courage isn't just about my own self-actualization. Jonah may have been missing out on something that would have made his life better. Yes, that's what I'm saying. But as this story dramatically shows us, from the sailors to the people of Nineveh, others' lives were at stake too. Jonah's story tells me that we are all on journeys. God's not an idiot. I think God chose Jonah, knowing Jonah would not go to Nineveh. But I don't think Jonah was actually a coward in God's eyes. I think God saw the seeds of a great, courageous person, capable of overcoming fear, insecurity, doubt, and danger. Seeds that just needed watering. And while Jonah does rise to the occasion and he courageously helps reform this wicked city, he's not a finished product. Interestingly, in the next chapter, chapter 4, Jonah seems to regress and get kind of upset and pouty about what God has done. But I wonder if maybe other character deficiencies are at work too. Maybe Jonah needs to grow in wisdom or compassion or gratitude or some other virtue. Or while his eventual visit to Nineveh was impressive, maybe there are just other significant fears in his life that he must face when he returns home, where other kinds of courage are still required. Jonah's journey is unfinished. So again I ask, where might courage be needed in your life, even in some small way? What obstacles, dangers, threats loom? What is your Nineveh? From what are you fleeing? And how might others benefit from your courage? In a moment, I'll leave some space for you to reflect on these questions, on how God might be calling you while Amar plays. Jonah did not just go from someone who was self-centered to God-centered, from mean guy to nice guy, from disobedient to obedient, which is how I was always told the story. Jonah found his courage. Jonah became a little more himself, thanks to a little guidance and a little patience on God's part. And of course, a very, very big fish.